The views and opinions expressed in this program do not necessarily represent those of Natural Bridges Media or KSQD's staff, volunteers, or underwriters.
Hello and welcome to Talk of the Bay. I am your host, Len B.A. And with me this evening is Martin Rizzo-Martinez. Martin Rizzo-Martinez is a historian and a producer of film, podcast, and other media content. After completing his PhD at UC Santa Cruz in 2016, he became a UC Chancellor's Postdoctoral Fellow at UC Riverside. Following his postdoc, he worked with California State Parks as the historian and tribal liaison for the Santa Cruz State Parks District, which allowed him to work closely with the Amamutsan Tribal Band and other tribal partners in the region. He is currently an assistant professor at UCSC in the Film and Digital Media Department. Martin is the author of the recently released book, We Are Not Animals, which takes a detailed look at the lives and survival strategies of the native peoples of the Monterey Bay area who survived the Spanish mission system and subsequently the Mexican and then American colonizing forces. Martin Rizzo-Martinez, welcome to Talk of the Bay.
Thank you, Len. Yeah, it's a pleasure to be here.
You have done an exquisite job of illustrating the real conditions of life for the various tribes and native villages of this area, how they were impacted by the actions of the multiple waves of colonizers, and the diverse ways they responded to and resisted domination. And you also describe the relationships between different groups who were forced together by the mission system. I wanted to start with having you describe how, as you unearthed these stories in your research, because your research spanned many years, when did it strike you to make that decision to write a book on the subject?
Yeah, that's a good question. You're right. The research did span a long time. It was the subject of my dissertation work up at UC Santa Cruz. In that process, probably a good 7 or 8 years of different research. And I, spent some time down in Mexico City in the archives down there, and the archives in Sacramento, Santa Barbara. All over. There's Monterey, of course, has some really important documents. But yeah, in putting that together, I think I really always hoped to eventually turn it into a book. I think once I realized, I guess I should put it this way, when I first started looking into this question, and I moved to Santa Cruz a long time ago and had been living here and had gotten to know some members of the local Native community, and I would ask around and wanted to know more about the specific history, what happened to people from this area specifically. And when I started talking to local historians and people who were doing this kind of work, I often got the answer, people said, well, they just died off or they disappeared, was kind of the common answer. And of course I knew that wasn't true. And so I thought, well, I'm going to look into it and see what I can, piece together. But once I started finding a lot of stuff, and the more I looked, the more I found. And, when I got to find the missionary records, right, the things that the priests kept, and I realized, wow, there's so many, stories of individuals, families that are in here that haven't come out, that people haven't written about or talked about. And a lot of the local, Native community had been disconnected from it through these waves of violence and colonial violence, as you point out. So I think once I realized that there was a lot of story that hasn't been told, I think I always kind of thought, okay, at some point I'll finish this and then I'll try to get it out there. But it was definitely a long process to get it to that point.
Yeah, I can imagine.
Yeah.
Well, I guess we have historical accounts of, the Portola expedition came through this area, and they encountered some people who were quite probably in the process of doing some ceremony when they encountered them in the Pajaro Valley, and they returned there later the scouts had found those people, and then when the whole party returned there later in hopes of getting some food because they didn't have enough to eat, the people were gone, but they had left a stuffed bird, which is how the Pajaro River got its name, from the Spaniards. But then it was a few years yet before the missions actually got this far north. And can you give us just a little background of kind of the expansion of the mission system and what the Spanish were intending to do there?
Yeah, if I may add a little bit with that Portola story,
Please.
That I think illustrates a lot about what somebody will find in the book. But one of the things that I should really highlight is that in doing this work, I worked very closely with members of the Amamutsin tribal band and with other local indigenous folks. And in particular, one person who was extremely helpful is the Amamutsin tribal band tribal historian, a fellow named Ed Ketchum. And when I would share with him my dissertation, and he would mark it up with notes on every page and his thoughts. And readers of the book will see his name all the time credited in there. He's almost a co-author. But when I talked to him about the Portola expedition, Ed had a great theory. And as you point out, right, the Portola expedition comes through, the scouts find this village, they get there, it's an empty village. The Spanish write about this in their diaries. They talk about it like as if, they assumed that they were afraid of them. And said, they must have been running from us. They must have been afraid of our mighty forces coming through kind of idea. Right. And one of the things I tried to do with the book is really try to recenter the story and try to understand what was it from their point of view, from the villagers. And Ed had a theory that he shared with me that I put in the book. But you're right, they encounter this giant bird. They say a giant eagle, right? And now thinking back on it, it kind of makes sense. It would probably be a condor that they're describing. They're saying it's, this huge bird. And Ed was able to piece together just different elements of it enough to point out that he thought that what was really happening at the time was the condor ceremony, which would make sense why they would put that there. And condor is, for a lot of indigenous Californian peoples in this area, condor is often like the speaker to the dead. And so Ed pointed out that if you read forward in this book, and sure enough, as I read forward, you find this, the Portola expedition, as they went up north to San Francisco, they came back down the same way, and then they passed down towards Monterey. And as they were about Moss Landing, they ran into a group of native people that had built a new village on the coast there, right at the coast. And I recognized them. The scouts said, these are the same people that were at that abandoned village. And so Ed has this theory that they had left there to go celebrate the condor ceremony, which the ocean is, for many Native California people, where the ancestors go, right, where the dead go when they die. And so according to his theory, right, they would have gone there to send messages to the dead. So from that point of view, right, it had nothing to do with the Spanish. They were doing their own practices. They had their own ceremonies that they were living their life around. And so throughout the book, I think I try to retell some of these stories that we have, these kind of colonial legacies and narratives. But I tried to look at the oral histories and look at the, what were the perspectives, try to understand, what were the practices of what is the culture of the people of this area and how might they have experienced these types of things.
Yeah, interesting.
Yeah, but the question about the mission, so when the Spanish arrived in California and what they called Alta California, which is, the American state of California today, they arrived in 1769, and they arrived at 2 points. They found 2 missions initially. One was in San Diego in Southern California, and the other one was in Monterey. And so the whole kind of Bay Area mission system starts there from Monterey, what they called Mission San Carlos, in 1769, 1770-ish. And I think when people think of the missions, conventionally people focus on the church aspect of it, the Franciscan missionaries, the padres, the Catholic side of it, the conversion aspect, which is certainly a part of that. But I think what a lot of people don't typically understand is that the mission served a very distinct purpose in the Spanish colonial project, and that was to provide labor, right? And by labor, this was the compelled, unpaid labor of Native peoples that once they received baptism there, they weren't allowed to leave the missions. And so if you look at the history of where the missions pop up, first in Monterey, then up in Santa Clara, and then San Francisco. And then after that, it eventually comes to Santa Cruz in 1791. So a good 15 years after the San Francisco one is 1776. So at that point, the reason that they end up coming down to Santa Cruz is that they're having a hard time getting the people of the Santa Cruz Mountains, the various different tribal members and families there. Some of them are going over to Santa Clara to check out the mission, to understand this, maybe to baptize their children in some cases, but they're not staying there, right? They're going back to their own homes. And so Santa Cruz is a geographically kind of isolated, tiny little place here. And so they had identified that as a strategic place where they could put a mission here, and then that could be the focus of trying to basically convert the peoples of the mountain areas, right, these kind of coastal mountain areas, into a labor force, right? And so whenever the Pueblo of San Jose needed a new building built, they would call upon native laborers, and they would, send them from the mission to go do this labor. And so native peoples would make, they tended to all the livestock and the agricultural fields here, which were devastating ecologically, right? The native plants that were already here, but they were being destroyed by all the livestock coming in. But they would tend to those. They would make clothing and leather and shoes and food. So, I mean, really all of the work that is being done, right, in California at that time period is all being done by native laborers who are laboring at these missions to provide for everyone else.
Yeah, and you mentioned people would come in to the missions for baptism, or maybe curiosity, or maybe a connection to somebody who's already held there, I guess. How sort of in general, how did the Spanish compel the native people to get into the missions, and how did they keep them there? And how successful were they in keeping them there?
Yeah, these are a mix of questions, and good ones, and these are kind of the big questions people have been asking, right? If in some ways, for me, right, if these missions have been such devastating spaces, which they absolutely were, right? The survival rates within the missions were terrible, conditions were awful, but why do people stay there? Why do they go there in the first place? And I do think in the earlier years, and one anthropologist, he's passed, Randy Milliken, wrote a great book about this maybe 25 years ago, A Time of Little Choice. But in that, he really looked at the early years of the Bay Area mission system up until about 1800. And he argued in there, and I think he's right to a large extent, that in those early years, it was a mix of different forces that are kind of push and pull factors that are doing it. Part of it, as you said, is, first of all, they're just kind of curious. Who are these people? They have, candles, they have mission bells, they have these different technologies, different things that are there, and people are kind of curious. What is their deal?
Yeah, domestic animals that they rode on. And
right. They have animals that people have not seen up here before, and they have a different relationship to animals, which I think they come to see as a much more kind of controlling relationship with livestock than they did with the animals up here. But they're curious about all these things. So what is this? So I think there is a level there. And then they realize that once they're baptized, the missionaries won't let them leave, right? They have to stay there. But people come in. Sometimes it's because people are sick, right? They're getting new diseases, illnesses that their medicine people don't have herbs or answers for. And so they go, well, these priests might have some answers. So they're curious about that. But then the other thing of it, especially in the tribes along here, right? Santa Cruz was the Oipi tribe. Just up the coast was the Cotoni tribe. The Aptos tribe was just a little bit further south, right, where Aptos is today. But a lot of these tribes are maybe 200. The Aptos maybe are a little bit bigger, but they're not a lot of people in them, right? They're different kind of groups that are built around their families. And if you have, say, 50 people get baptized and now they have to stay at the mission, your ability as a group of 200 to function, to engage in the types of trade and economic commerce that you have, ceremony that you have, right? Just the political and social cohesion becomes devastated over time. And so you have tribal leaders and chiefs who decide to go into the mission because they realize, well, I'm losing all my people, but my people are in the mission. A new leader is going to step in that vacuum, and they're going to have control. So there's a mix of political and social economic factors. Trade routes are disrupted by this. So there's a disruption that happens by the missions being there and by people having to relocate there. And then there's the ecological side. So I mentioned before, but livestock require acres and acres, right? Hundreds, thousands of acres eventually as it grows. And this is where, the lands where they place the livestock and the crop rows are exactly where these, fields are that people are tending to their grasslands, for their baskets, for foods. So what I found when I started looking at the patterns of when did people come into the missions, I found that they are in the winter months, right? When food would have been tougher to get by, the numbers rise, right? People come in. So I think starvation does play a role in this. Yeah.
And I've heard reports from other researchers who think there's good evidence that among the Wipi and Kotoni particularly, that they relied more on the grass seeds as sort of the fundamental sort of basis of the diet than say acorns, which was also really common among, particularly as you get further north in California. And in the Sierra foothills, where people relied a lot on acorn as a staple, that the people around here relied so much on grass seeds. So if they were losing that land, if the grass seed crop is being eaten by cattle and horses, that would be a very serious consequence. So,
and the basketry, right? That they make these baskets that are not just used for storage, but are used for shoes and are used for, houses and homes. I mean, there's so many different things that the basketry and the grasses, and those seeds, absolutely. I should point out too, though, because I think there's different waves, and as time goes on, these dynamics change. And in those early years, I think, the Spanish do have soldiers that are there too. But the soldiers are very aware that they're outnumbered, right? There's maybe 10, 20 soldiers and there's thousands of native peoples, right? And they have weapons and they can fight back. And they often do, right? And we forget about those stories, but they attack, there's different waves of attacks. But in those early years, so it's more of this push and pull. But as time goes on, and as people are dying in the missions, and as the Spanish are wanting to bring new people in there, they increasingly start moving further and further away geographically from the missions. And that process, by I would say 1805, maybe 15 years after the founding of Mission Santa Cruz, the dynamic is a much more military one, right? So by that time, into the 1810s and 20s, there's stories, there's letters where, the padres say, the soldiers came back and they brought every last person from this village, even the injured and the old, and, what a celebration, all these souls to be saved, they've removed them, but they're marching people back, and one of the things I looked at was in the 1920s and 30s, there were fortunately some, especially by J.P. Harrington as one ethnographer, but there's others who were doing interviews with Native peoples who had, their parents had been at the missions, right? They were born just after. And so there are a number of stories that survive, right? That people were able to share. And in those stories, and I included quite a few in the book that I ran across, but yeah, that you hear all these stories of people, how did they get to the mission? They were brought there at the point of a gun. They were, so it does become a much more violent process as time went on.
Yeah. Yeah. To actually I've seen actual, etchings or something of people roped together.
Yeah.
Literally tied together and being taken in by men on horseback. So. Yeah.
There was one of the stories that persists in the Amamutsan community. But I've seen letters that confirm the same things. But I think one of the things they would do is they would tie the thumbs together of people and march them. It's an interesting thing, but I see this over and over again. The Spanish would say that, and they would usually target the women and children first because they knew that the men would follow. And of course they wouldn't leave them, right? They wouldn't just let them take them. They would come after them.
Right.
Yeah.
And I know the Spanish had laws to prevent the indigenous people from, gaining certain powers. Like they weren't supposed to ride horses, they weren't supposed to have guns, and some other things too that I can't remember. But and of course those rules didn't always get aligned with.
Well, yeah, that you bring up a good point. You asked earlier, like, and to what extent did they keep them there too, right? But this kind of gets to that point. But they absolutely did, right? There was in Spanish, if you look at Spanish colonial society over the Americas, right? Thinking back to Mexico and South America and everything, there's, the Spanish instituted in their process, it was a dual system. There was the Republic of the Spanish, and the Republic of the Indians, basically, is how they kind of framed it. And there were different rules depending on who you were. If you were European, then you had rights to these, and you could have horses, you could have weapons, and Indians could not. In that society, right? It was very bifurcated. It was very split between who had rights and didn't. But there's always exceptions to that, right? And so there was a big tradition here of indigenous peoples with horses, right? Who did have horses, and so the vaqueros, and so there's ways that those things did bypass. Thinking of the missions too, when you asked that, like there were, even though they were made to stay there. They had to make concessions, the Padres did. And so one of the things that they allowed was they allowed them seasonal, what they call paseos or passports, where they would allow them to go back to their homelands each season to visit people who are still out there. And there's all these stories. Some of the Russian travelers wrote about this, and they describe a scene, I think it's up in San Francisco, where some of the elderly who are not able to make the trek, they walk with them to like a mountaintop, and they just watch their families leave, and then they wait for them to come back, from their return for that. It's kind of a heartbreaking scene that they describe there. But the missionaries talk about it, and they say, well, if we didn't allow them these passes, we could never keep them here. There's no way we could, right? And it's interesting admission there. But also there was an issue with them not coming back. And it's interesting because we look at these records, but the records are fallible. And I found, for example, like here's just one example. I think it's 1798. Every year at all the missions, they'd have to write their reports of how many Indians are living here, the men, the women, how many new buildings, all these kinds of inventories that they would write and send back to Spain or down to Mexico City. And so we have all these records. And in that particular, I want to say they report maybe 350 people living at Mission Santa Cruz. And then I find a letter from one of the Padres, and it's maybe dated a week or two before this inventory is written. And he's writing somebody else, and he's complaining, and he says, the 180 people who fled, they haven't still come back, right? We're still trying to send soldiers to get them. So there's ways that these records, I think, are a little flawed, and sometimes and you think about it, it's like, well, why is he saying the numbers are higher? Well, probably because it has to do with funding and because you don't want to get in trouble for them being gone. But the reality is that they're always struggling with fugitives, right? People run away in mass numbers, and the soldiers go after them, right? And they employ other native peoples to try to track them down. I mean, it's constantly a back and forth on this. That's much more porous, right? People are leaving the missions and getting away, but then being taken back. So it is a constant give and take, going back and forth.
Yeah. If you're just tuning in to Talk of the Bay here at KSQD, my guest is Martin Rizzo-Martinez. He is an assistant professor at UCSC and an historian who has done an enormous amount of research on the native people of this Monterey Bay area, and has a recently released book, We Are Not Animals, and we'll get into that more as we go forward. So, Martin, you mentioned, like in some ways in the workings of the missions, that they would sometimes the missionaries would employ other people, other native people who are part of the mission, to go try to return the fugitives who fled. Mm-hmm. And that kind of leads me to another question. We know that in this particular area of what, more or less corresponds to what's now Santa Cruz and a bit up the coast, was the Weepi tribe, which was an Awaswas speaking people. But there were other tribes, people from other tribes were brought into the mission in Santa Cruz. And I wonder if you could talk about what the mix of populations was like. And I know it changed over time, but if you could give us some background on that.
Sure. Yeah, that's a great question. In the early years, so again, Mission Santa Cruz founded in 1791. The first, say, 7 years in Mission Santa Cruz, there was probably about, 8 to 10 different tribes from this direct area. And in this area, you're right, the language was Awaswas, and this is one of the 8 different Ohlone languages of the Greater Bay Area. And we don't really know exactly the boundaries, but it's basically from just south of Año Nuevo down to just north of Watsonville along the coast and then up into the mountains. And those first 7 years, I would say it's primarily a Waswas-speaking Ohlone people from this whole range right here. Mm-hmm. But starting in the late 1790s, 1797 and 8, they start to take in and bring in people from over the hill. So this would be Mutsun Ohlone speakers from like the Gilroy area, from down around there, kind of getting into the Pajaro Basin and moving out. And then moving eastwards, they start to take in tribes like the Sumu and the Tomoye, who are again, they're Mutsun Ohlone speaking tribes, but they're out like by Pacheco Pass. And so what you have at Mission Santa Cruz, and this is just that second wave, and then there's a third wave too that comes from even further. But you have a diversity of peoples. One of the few accounts that we have where one of the people at the mission is interviewed is a fellow named Lorenzo Asisara, and he's interviewed in 1770s and then again in 1790. And so we have a couple interviews with him, and he talks about it. He says he refers to it as the diverse nations at the mission, right? And he says there were all these different languages being spoken, so people didn't really understand themselves. And we tend to think of it as this kind of binary of like the Spanish and the Indians, but the reality is that each of these missions had a ton of different people. I think at Mission Santa Cruz, I would say there's about 35 different tribes that are eventually taken there. And then at this third wave that starts in maybe 1805, 1810, and after 1810, it's exclusively Yokuts people. And Yokuts, they're actually what we consider now Northern Valley Yokuts, but it's people from the San Joaquin Valley. So we're talking about like Madero and Los Banos and, all the way out in that area there, which the Spanish referred to them as Tulareños, as the Tule peoples, because it's kind of like the swampy areas there with the Tule reeds. But in some of that, and that's what I think you're kind of getting at, I get into one of the later chapters, but one of the families that does become kind of the right-hand go-to people of the Padres is one of this Yokuts families, that of Coleto as the chief, and his sons who take on a lot of these roles as the people who get sent out to capture the fugitives. And this is a way where I would say from my looking at it, the Spanish are in some ways playing this diversity, these different tribes off of each other. And in some ways, the Yokuts are maybe playing the Spanish off of that too to get certain rights, right? Sure. They end up with some of the adobe homes. They end up with getting more rights, And I think that we have to look again at this in the context of the overall loss and devastating times, because when you have at Mission Santa Cruz, it was over 90% of the people baptized there didn't survive to the end of the missions, right? In this very brief time. And when you have
that's amazing. 90%. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean,
mortality
it's
rate.
Just over 90%, and it's devastating. So I think there's that question too of like, I think that to some extent, some of the Yokuts people who do choose to go in these roles, I mean, we have to understand that they're looking at a devastating situation where survival is really far from guaranteed, right? So they're making, again, these choices to try to survive a really difficult time period.
Yeah. And all these tribes, of course, had relationships prior to the colonial era. And, there was certainly trade and intermarriage, but there was also conflict. So for them to be brought together, there had to be a lot of negotiating, both within each person's individual decision-making and within each tribal group to figure out how are they going to be in relationship to the mission masters, the Spanish masters, and all their fellow victims who are in there. So complex. Well, we're going to take a really short break, and we'll be right back with more with Martin Rizzo-Martinez right after this. Don't touch that dial. I'm Len B.A., and here with me is Martin Rizzo-Martinez. Martin Rizzo-Martinez is a historian, a producer of film podcasts and other media content. He is an assistant professor in the Film and Digital Media Department at UCSC, but also as a historian has done an enormous amount of research about the native peoples of the Monterey Bay Area. Was previously the staff historian for the Santa Cruz district of the California State Parks. And he has written a book, We Are Not Animals, which talks about, from the indigenous perspective, the experience of native peoples in dealing with the waves of colonists who came into this area, the Spanish first, and then as Mexico got its independence, the changes in policy under Mexico, and then the changes when California became a state in the United States. Well, Martin, I wanted to ask you, because we've talked a little bit, just kind of touched on the brutal treatment that people received at the hands of missionaries in many cases. But there's only one occasion of a mission priest being killed by the natives, only one occasion that we know of in California overall. And that was right here in Santa Cruz. And I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about the events leading up to and the assassination of Father Quintana.
Yeah, I'd be happy to. And this is the focus of my third chapter, really focuses in on this particular event because it is pretty monumentous. And I should point out, though, that he was not the only padre. There was a padre, Jaime, who was killed down in San Diego earlier. And I think that, though I hear what you're saying, and I think that that's something that I tried to focus on in the book was it wasn't, yes, there were some devastating times. We talked about this. But there was also constantly resistance in different forms. And I think if people were to look at any mission, any region in California, you would find different stories of resistance. And I think it's important because we've overlooked those, right? Historically, we don't talk about those very often, and that gets buried. But in this particular case, what happened here, the assassination itself took place in 1812, so about 20 years after the founding of the mission. And in this case, with Padre Quintana, and he was far from the only one like this, but he was particularly abusive. So the stories, even by the Spanish accounts who wrote about this after it happened, they all admit, they say, yeah, he beat the Indians there pretty severely. And this particular story, we're really fortunate. I mentioned Lorenzo Asada is one of the survivors of Mission Santa Cruz, but in his interviews in the 1870s, his father was actually involved, was one of the conspirators who was involved with this. And so he related a ton of details about how it all came together and who was involved and all this. And so I wrote about it quite a bit and was able to kind of follow the lead of Asisara and figure out who was who and how they were all connected. And ultimately what emerges is that this Padre Quintana, who had beat two young men nearly to death, and as a result, a group of indigenous peoples there, men and women, got together and they decide, they have this whole conversation, what are we going to do about this guy? And they also knew that he had just had made a special whip that was fitted with iron tips on it so that it would cut deeper when he would punish people. And this is a common thing. The Padres would not commonly have the iron tips, but commonly whip them severely as punishment. And so they realized they had to do something about it. And one of the things that emerged as I really started to look into this is that there was a woman at the center of the story who is credited with coming up with the strategy of how to do it. She's the one, she plays a key role in telling the padre, and what she does is she tells the padre that her husband is dying and that the padre needs to administer last rites. And she says, well, this will draw him out of his room, and then the young men can attack him and do this. And in the story that Asasada gives, he says that she does it once, they kind of chicken out, they don't kill him, and then she says, okay, let's do it again. They do it again, and they again chicken out the second time. And so at this point, the woman, whose name is Yakenensat, she's baptized and given the name of Fausta, but she tells him a third time. She says, if you don't do what you've told, what you've promised, I'm going to tell him about everything and reveal the whole plot. And so that third time through, they actually do carry through. They kill this padre, and then they put his body back into his room, and they're able to conceal it and make it look like he died of natural causes. And that story, that lasts for about a year until some of the soldiers overhear people, and then they eventually arrest a bunch of men. They never arrest Yakenensai, and I think that's because the Spanish are looking at it through their own patriarchal lens, and I don't think that they can conceive that this woman would have played such a central role. And she's a fascinating figure, and I write about her a lot in there, and I do believe she was one of the definitely spiritual leader of her tribe, the Sumu, possibly a political leader. And it's worth pointing out that Native women in California were often in roles of leadership. It was a different society. They didn't have the same patriarchal approach that the Spanish did. But yeah, there's all sorts of layers to that I get into there. I found a similar story parallel story up in San Jose area where another padre was invited to a village to administer last rites on a villager, and he gets ambushed on his way out there. And when I read about this, and I realized this would have happened maybe 50 miles above where Yakenensat's tribe was, where she was. So I realized she had learned about this, right? She must have heard about this, and then she imports a strategy. And I think that there's a way that indigenous peoples are learning and transmitting ideas, and there's networks of communication that are happening, and strategies of resistance that are transcending the mission boundaries too, right? And going across those lines. And one other thing I'll point out about this is it's very interesting. It stuck with me that they use a strategy where they ask the padre to administer last rites. And I think that the reason for this, when I thought about it, why would they use that particular strategy? And I realized a couple of things. So for Native people of the Bay Area, when somebody died, people were divided into different, what anthropologists call moieties, or different like clans, right? Like Beer Clan and Deer Clan. And so when somebody died from one particular family, one group, people from the other family would then be responsible for taking care of the mortuary stuff and the burial and everything. And this is it's a ritual of social cohesion, right? That kind of builds reciprocity. It builds alliances between those. It allows the grieving tribe to focus on the grieving and the loss, and they take care of things. And when the Spanish Franciscan missionaries come there, and they insist that their ways are the right ways, right? That the other ways are the heathen ways, or the wrong ways, right? And so you could imagine them saying, no, you can't do it this way. You have to go through these Catholic processes. And so I imagine that indigenous peoples then would have realized, okay, and probably resisted this, and then realized, okay, if we tell them somebody dies, they're going to insist that they are there, right? And so in some ways they realize, well, this is a way that we can get them to expose themselves, right? They're going to be, fall over themselves to get out there to take care of this, and then we can be ready for them then. So
yeah, good strategy.
Yeah,
really.
And it worked.
Yeah. And so what happened when the missions were forced to divest their lands by the Mexican government? How did that affect the Native people who were part of the mission system at that point? Yeah,
this is an area that I think is unfortunately a little understudied, but it is really interesting. So the New Mexican government, right, which begins in 1820s, and it's throwing off kind of the colonial Spanish legacy, this whole kind of anti-colonial movement there in Mexico. And so there is a very much a liberal push for against kind of divesting the churches from all of their holdings, right? The church is one of these big colonial instruments across the Spanish colonial world that owns so much lands. I mean, it still does today,
Right.
But it's, very much so there. And so there's a push against that. There's a push against some of the old kind of racial hierarchies that have been instilled there. And so from Mexico's point of view, in the 1820s, there is a call to turn over mission lands to Indians. It's to release people from or emancipate people. Even the language is being used there, very similar to our slave system, right, in the South. And so there's a push to emancipate people, to turn over lands. But what happens here in California is that they don't do that, and they actually hold off, delay doing that, and Native people are still bound into the missions until 1839, so almost 20 years after independence, certainly 13 or so years after these calls for them to be emancipated. And in that meantime, a lot of the wealthy California families are grabbing up all the lands. And so by the time 1839 rolls around, and the missions are therefore at that point forced to turn over what is left of the lands to Native people. Here in Santa Cruz, there isn't a whole lot of land to go, but there are two communities that form here in those years. By 1840, there's a community of mostly Awaswas and Mutsinaloni peoples who live up on the west side over by Westlake up there, and then there's a larger group of mostly Yokuts, but other peoples who live in what's known as the Potrero, which is down behind the mission where Potrero Street still is and where the Costco is these days. And it's that area because the west side lands, Native people have continued to live there for probably a good 15 years or so, but by the 1850s, those lands have been bought up and there's only a handful of Native people still up there. But most of the Native community has coalesced behind the mission in the Potrero. And that area becomes kind of known as the reservation, right, or as the Potrero. And Native peoples, that is a Native village pretty much up until about the 1880s, almost
Long
into the
time.
1890s. Yeah. And I write about that in the last chapters because there's really interesting stories that happen with the community living back there into those years. So that's kind of what happened. I mean, they're really... There's a little bit of land that happens, but not really. And then the survivors end up kind of moving where they can make it. Some down to Watsonville, others go up to San Francisco or different places. But yeah.
Wow. If you're just tuning in to Talk of the Bay here at KSQD, my guest is Martin Rizzo-Martinez. He's an historian and an author, and we're talking about what he learned from his research for his book, We Are Not Animals, about the Native people of this area and how they adapted and survived through successive waves of colonization. So one of the descendants of those who survived the missions was a man named Justiniano Rojas. What did you discover about him?
So Rojas, and if you see the book, it's his picture that's on the cover, and there's a couple of photographs that were taken of him in the 1870s. And his story is very interesting. He was at Mission Santa Cruz. He survives it. He becomes one of kind of these elderly indigenous survivors of the mission into the 1870s. And there's a handful of other folks who still make it in that time. His story is kind of interesting because in the 1870s, he gets sick, and a newspaper reporter goes in to talk to him, and they what they don't realize when they start talking to him is they start to look up his name and they say, oh, who is this guy, and try to figure it out. What happened to the missions is Native people come up with their own names. When they were baptized, they were given a Spanish name, and often these names are recycled, right? So after somebody dies, that name, they give it to somebody else. So there were 3 or 4 Justiniano Rojases at the mission, depending on what timeline. And so when they go to look at the, back in the 1870s in the book, and they say, oh, there was I think it was a 40-year-old guy named Rojas, back in 1800 or something. And so they start doing this math and they say, oh, this guy's 120 years old. And so when the newspapers, the Sentinel writes about this, and then his picture and his image actually gets sent worldwide. They have a a portrait of him made and sent to the Vatican, and then there's a picture of him used at the World's Fair in Chicago, and he kind of becomes this celebrity in a sense. Not that I don't think he ever saw any gains from this or anything at all. In fact, he dies maybe a couple of years after they first write that article. But the myth of him, right? He gets this mythology around, this ancient Indians living in California are used as like a tourist thing and as a booster to come to California. The water's so clean and the air's so clean, you can live to 120. Or, it's this kind of story. And so what I did in this is
anything you can market, really.
Yeah, exactly. I was able to trace out, and some people, there's a local historian, Jeff Dunn, who's great and written some great things, and other people have kind of written about him, but I was able to figure out who he was actually in the records. And so I write about it in one of the chapters here. And I think his real story is much more interesting than the fantastical one that they handed out, right? And he was from just over the hill. He's one of the Mutsun Ohlone people from kind of just on the other side of the Santa Cruz Mountains. And interesting story. Came here with his family. Some of his family ended up running away, were fugitives, right? They kind of find out that they had died years later after they left here. And so he kind of just finds a way to navigate through these times and make his way through. And a very interesting man for sure. We still have, I think there's a road in Santa Cruz called Rojas. And in the 1950s, there was some of these Santa Cruz historical pageants would have a guy dressed up like an Indian. They call him Chief Rojas. So
wow.
He kind of, in Santa Cruz lore,
mythology just carried forward.
Yeah, absolutely.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow. Well, there's so many things we could go into here, and I'm tempted, because we only have about 10 minutes left, to try to cover the whole breadth of the book in terms of the history. But I think I want to default instead to just sort of some just interesting details. Like one of the things you mention in the book is that the Spanish priests had reported, and the documentation is amazing. Like what you found, and I'm assuming a lot of this was from archives in Mexico City, but probably from many places. The Spanish priests reported encountering offerings left by the indigenous people. Like they would leave things in certain places that they obviously had, left. They would repeatedly leave offerings in those spots. And I wonder if you could talk about, what we know at this point about the spiritual context of those offerings that people leave. Yeah, well,
I think that one of the things that's interesting is that for indigenous Californians, for certainly in this area, spirituality was definitely a central part of life, ceremony. But it was, the best way to put it is in contrast with Catholicism, at least the historic one, where for the Franciscans, it was either or, right? Everything was like you're either a believer or you're a heathen, right?
Right.
And it had this. And for indigenous peoples, there were different belief systems, right? It was a much more plural way of looking at things, right? So you could believe this and you could believe this, right? And so I think that gets back to this question of why were people coming into the missions. I do think that indigenous peoples were able to look at Catholicism with curiosity and say, hey, I'm interested, what is it that the priests are doing? What are your ceremonies? What are your songs? But they didn't see it as like, oh, you're right, we're wrong, right? If we do this, we can't do that. And so that's a very foreign way of looking at things, right? That wasn't the way people did stuff. Here, I think in a lot of ways, right, in terms of, and just social practices, I think that we probably have a lot more in common with indigenous peoples here than we do with the Catholics, really, in terms of just our values and everything at a lot of levels. But when it comes to spirituality, the example you're drawing on is, there was in some of these records, there's an example where I think it's on Angel Island where the Padres and a group are moving of Spanish soldiers are moving across the island, and they encounter an area where, it's in this example, they find like an offering, right? And they see that the Native people have left shells and they've left beads and a little bit of food, right? And they recognize it's very clearly like a holy place, right? That they're marking this place
like an
with
altar.
this, like an altar. And so, according to the Spanish record, they say, of course, we burned it, right? Because it's a heathen offering altar. We can't let it stand. And then, in contrast to that, there's a story where I think the first time the Spanish are moving through, I think it's Coyote Creek in San Jose area, and it must be like one of the priests' holy days. So they stop and they have their ceremony, and they set up some crosses, and then they leave. And this is an area that's indigenous territories. The Spanish haven't really developed that area at that point, but they come back through about a year later, and they encounter those same crosses that they had left there. And at this point, they find that what did the Native people do when they encountered this? Well, they added to it. So the Native people obviously saw, hey, this is an altar. And so they add feathers to it, and they add shells, and they add this. And so I think that example kind of illustrates a very different way of looking, right? Where they say, oh, okay, the priests have, designated, okay, we'll add to this, we'll add our own ceremonies to this, right?
Yeah.
Very different.
Yeah,
way.
and there's I know this is true for a lot of indigenous cultures in Latin America, but for example, there's a corresponding bit from the Mayan people in the highlands of Guatemala that as they adopted these, all the different saints' days that the Catholic Church has, they also had corresponding, days of particular ceremonies or particular festivals. And the pre-Spanish, pre-Catholic, they had these what you might call a prayer bundle or a ceremonial bundle that was different objects all bound together. And when they adopted the Catholic ways, those bundles went inside the statues of the saints and were still in there.
Yeah.
Because they incorporated their old belief right into the Catholic belief just because the dates corresponded. And obviously it's partly survival because as long as they're observed as being practicing Catholics, they're somewhat protected. But also they were willing to do that. They were willing to take and combine the two and integrate the two. And I think that's a really interesting contrast between our religion is right and everybody else is going to hell approach, which is kind of interesting.
And I think it gets to what you're talking about is there's ways that you can see in the historical records the indigenous peoples found ways to preserve their culture, preserve their practices, to continue with their ceremonies, their dances, their ways of seeing things, and draw on those as a strength, right, as a means to survive in those times. And I think that's, it should be said too that very much continues today, right, with contemporary indigenous communities who still are relearning their languages and their ceremonies and drawing on those as a strength, which is a beautiful thing to see. So it's nice to see that perseveres, right. And I guess I'll just throw this in. I know we're getting towards the end, but a lot of people tend to look at the mission and say, oh, the mission's destroyed Native people or these institutions. But I think it bears repeating. A friend of mine who's a professor up at UCSC, and he's Sim Schneider, who's a member of the tribe up north, the Federated Indians of Great Rancheria. But he'll often say things like, actually, Native peoples endured way beyond the missions, right? The missions were closed 150 years ago, and they're still here, So I think that's an important thing to acknowledge and recognize.
Yeah, and the state of California had an official policy of genocide for a while as a state of the United States, and the fact that people survived at all is pretty extraordinary.
Yeah, a testament to people's perseverance, their strength, ingenuity, all of that for sure.
Yeah, and we tend to romanticize the indigenous people. We kind of see them as that they vanished, as if they vaporized into thin air and left no descendants. But we also assume that they, that the land was completely pristine and unaltered, like they did nothing to the land, which is clearly not true. And I wonder if you could talk about the legacy that indigenous culture has left here, and what the descendants are actively doing, which you've just alluded to a little bit. But if you could talk a little bit more about the descendants of the tribes of this region.
Sure. I think, what you're referring to, of course, is these practices of land management, which, as American California Society, we're just learning in the last 20 years just the extent of indigenous knowledge and practices and how important that's been, right? Taking just one example, the controlled burns that people have done for millennia, they get prohibited starting in 1793, the Spanish outlaw burns, and that continued up until now. And we see these devastating wildfires that are a product of that. But we've learned now that Native people have always known that there is a way to do that can keep that going. And I'm happy to say that in particular here in this area, the Amamutsin tribal band, the Amamutsin land stewards, have been working really hard, very closely with state parks for a while now, 15 years at least, to start tending to the forest. In fact, when the CZU wildfires came in, some of the areas that were hit the least were the areas that have been managed by fires up near Año Nuevo. But I think, we're, as a society, we're just now really starting to realize how little we've acknowledged that wisdom that's there. And so I think that's one area that's starting to happen again. I should point out, in the Monterey Bay area, there's a number of tribes, especially down in Monterey area. There's 3 or 4 different Rumsen groups. The Osen, the Esalen tribe recently got some lands back in the Big Sur area. And then, there's many different tribes, and throughout the Bay area, there's a bunch of different Ohlone groups, and then there's a lot of families that are connected to those but aren't affiliated with groups. So there really is a diversity of different indigenous peoples in this area, and I want to encourage anyone to take the opportunity to go listen to different tribal members talk about the work that they're doing. There's a lot of great work that's out there that people are doing in so many levels. So it's really important to listen to, learn from, and to advocate on behalf of. I should point out that Amamutsin are fighting to protect Eurostock too, which is something people can look into.
Right. Well, we just have a minute left, and I want to make sure you have a book signing coming up, and I want to make sure you tell folks about that and how to find out more about what you're doing.
Yeah, if you want to, my book is coming out in paperback version. I'm having a book talk at Bookshop Santa Cruz. It's the last Wednesday in May. I think it's May 29th at 7 p.m. It'll be a book talk and signing there. I also want to take a moment to plug, I co-produce a podcast with a good friend of mine, Daniel Stoneblum, and it's called Challenging Colonialism. But it's basically came out of, I've had the opportunity to speak with and learn from so many amazing indigenous folks today who are doing great work, and decided to start recording and start getting that out there for people to listen to. We cover a whole range of different topics, a lot of different things. In fact, we have a little series coming out very soon where we've been talking to indigenous Californians and Palestinian scholars and talking about solidarity. So take a listen to that. Thank you.
Great. Well, Martin Rizzo-Martinez, this has been fascinating, and I really appreciate you coming on the program. And perhaps we can have you back, and I look forward to being able to be there at the book signing May 29th at Bookshop Santa Cruz.
Thank you, Len.
Thank you.